Fluorescent lights flickered in the underground parking garage, casting long, sickly shadows against the damp concrete. Gabriel didn't notice the chill. He only saw the way Chloe flinched when the car door slammed shut. A tiny, instinctual jerk of her narrow shoulders. It wasn't a gunshot or a rival syndicate's threat that stopped him in his tracks. It was the mottled purple-yellow stain creeping above the collar of her cheap cotton sweater. Something ugly and dormant woke up inside him. The digital clock on the microwave glowed a sharp, unforgiving green. 2:14 a.m. Gabriel stood in the entryway of his penthouse, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him with a finality that usually brought relief. Tonight, it just sounded like a vault ceiling. The air inside smelled of ozone expensive leather and the faint sterile scent of bleach his cleaning crew used on the hardwood floors. He shrugged off his wet overcoat, the fabric heavy with Chicago rain, and the lingering stench of cigar smoke from a backroom sit-down that had gone 3 hours too long. His knuckles ached. His jaw was tight enough to crack a molar. He didn't want a drink. He wanted silence. He walked into the sunken living room, unbuttoning his cuffs, the faint metallic clink of his watch strap, the only noise over the low hum of the central heating. That was when he saw her. Chloe. She was curled into a tight defensive knot on the far end of his charcoal sectional. A stack of leather-bound ledgers rested on the glass coffee table beside a half-empty mug of tea that had gone cold hours ago. She was his front company's junior auditor. Quiet. Skittish. She wore oversized cardigans that smelled like artificial vanilla, and anxiety always keeping her eyes glued to the floorboards when he walked past her desk. She was only here because he had demanded the quarterly wash reports before morning, and she, terrified of failing, had delivered them by hand. She must have fallen asleep waiting for him. Gabriel sighed a harsh rasp of breath through his nose. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling a flicker of irritation. He wasn't running a halfway house. He didn't want a sleeping woman in his sanctuary. He walked toward her, intending to wake her, tell her to take a cab on the company dime, and get out. The floorboards didn't creak. He knew exactly where to step. He stopped 3 feet from the couch. The city lights from the floor-to-ceiling windows cast a pale blue-gray wash over her face. She looked exhausted even in sleep. Dark circles dragged at the skin beneath her eyes. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. She was wearing a faded gray crew neck, the fabric pilling at the sleeves. As she shifted in her sleep, pulling her knees closer to her chest, the collar of the sweater slipped down her shoulder. Gabriel froze. At first, his brain exhausted and wired on black coffee, and adrenaline couldn't process the shapes. It looked like spilled ink, a shadow. But the ambient light caught the texture of her skin, and the illusion vanished. It was a bruise. No, not a bruise. A collection of them. A brutal, overlapping tapestry of ruptured blood vessels. Dark plum bleeding into a sickly, jaundiced yellow at the edges, wrapping around her collarbone and disappearing down her sternum. In the center of the largest contusion, near the delicate hollow of her throat, the skin was scraped raw, a shallow crescent moon. The shape of a thumb pressing down hard. A handprint. A large one. The silence in the room suddenly felt deafening. The hum of the heater faded into a high-pitched ring in Gabriel's ears. He stared at the marks. He was a man who trafficked in violence. He understood the mechanics of pain. He knew what a face looked like after it met concrete, what a rib cage felt like giving way under a steel-toed boot. Violence was a transaction to him, a language of leverage and consequence. It was business. But this was petty. This was cruel. This was a messy, uncontrolled rage taken out on someone who weighed maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. Something cold and heavy dropped in his stomach. It wasn't a heroic surge of protectiveness. Gabriel wasn't a hero. He was a cynic, a pragmatist, a man who survived by never caring about collateral damage. The feeling welling up in his chest was darker. It was a suffocating, violent possessiveness. It felt like an insult, an intrusion. Someone had put their hands on something that existed in his orbit, bringing the messy, chaotic violence of the gutter into his clean, structured world. He stepped closer. He could smell her now, that cheap vanilla shampoo masking the sharp, sour tang of stale sweat. The smell of someone who had been sweating cold. The smell of fear. His hand twitched. He wanted to touch the bruised skin, to measure his own fingers against the phantom handprint on her throat, to gauge the size of the man he was going to have to dismantle. Before he could pull his hand back, Chloe inhaled sharply. Her eyes snapped open. Panic is a physical thing. Gabriel saw it detonate behind her eyes. She didn't just wake up. She fractured into consciousness. Her body jerked violently backward, her spine hitting the armrest of the couch with a dull thud. She gasped a wet, choking sound, and her hands flew up, not to strike, but to shield her face. Gabriel didn't step back to give her space. He stayed exactly where he was, a looming silhouette against the city skyline, his broad shoulders blocking the ambient light. "Mr. Rossi," she choked out, her voice a rusted wire. She scrambled into a sitting position, her fingers digging frantically into the collar of her sweater, yanking it up so hard the seams groaned. She tugged the fabric all the way up to her chin, her knuckles white. "I'm sorry. The ledgers. You said you needed them tonight. I sat down, and I just—" She was talking too fast, the words stumbling over each other, desperate to fill the suffocating silence. She wouldn't look at his face. Her eyes darted from his Italian leather shoes to the edge of the glass table, anywhere but his eyes. "Stop talking," Gabriel said. His voice was low-flat, devoid of the smooth, charismatic polish he used in boardrooms and back alleys. It sounded like gravel scraping over ice. Chloe's mouth snapped shut. She swallowed hard. He watched the delicate muscles in her throat work, watched how the movement clearly sent a spike of pain through her, based on the subtle wince that tightened the corners of her eyes. He hated how small she looked. He hated that she was terrified of him right now, and he hated even more that she had a reason to be terrified of someone else. Gabriel turned his back on her. He walked to the liquor cabinet built into the mahogany wall unit. He didn't want a drink, but his hands felt strangely light, buzzing with an electric need to hit something. He needed to hold a glass. He grabbed a crystal tumbler, and the first bottle, his fingers touched an aged rye. The heavy clink of glass against glass echoed in the quiet room. He poured 2 fingers. He didn't drink it. He just held it, letting the amber liquid catch the dim light. "Who did it?" he asked. He didn't turn around. Behind him he heard the faint rustle of cotton, the squeak of leather as she shifted her weight. "Did what?" Her voice was unnaturally high, feigning a confusion so transparent it insulted his intelligence. Gabriel closed his eyes. A muscle feathered in his jaw. "Do not lie to me in my own home, Chloe. It's 2 a.m. I've had a week that would put a lesser man in an asylum, and I am entirely out of patience." He turned slowly. She was sitting stiffly, her arms crossed tight over her chest, holding herself together. I don't know what you mean, she whispered. Gabriel set the glass down on the cabinet. Hard. The heavy thwack made her flinch again. That tiny involuntary jerk of her shoulders. It made a vein throb at his temple. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping right in front of the coffee table, forcing her to tilt her head up to look at him. The bruising on your collarbone. The handprint on your throat. Tell me you fell down a flight of stairs. Go ahead. Tell me you walked into a door. Give me the cliché so I know exactly how much of an idiot you think I am. Chloe's breathing hitched. Her eyes, wide and glassy, finally met his. They were a muted hazel currently blown wide with adrenaline. It's a personal matter, Mr. Rossi. It has nothing to do with work. The ledgers are perfect. I double-checked the routing numbers. I don't give a damn about the ledgers right now. He interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into the dangerous quiet register that made his lieutenant sweat. He leaned down, placing both hands flat on the glass coffee table, trapping her in his space. The scent of vanilla was entirely overwhelmed now by the sharp metallic tang of his own cologne and the rainwater drying on his clothes. You work for me, Gabriel said softly, enunciating every syllable. You breathe my air. You sit in my office. You handle my money. That makes you mine to manage. Someone putting their hands on you without my permission is a breach of my security. So I will ask you one last time. Who? It was a lie. It had nothing to do with security. It was a raw primal reaction masking itself as a logical business concern, but neither of them was going to acknowledge that. Chloe stared up at him. For a second, beneath the terror and the exhaustion, Gabriel saw a flash of profound, bitter resentment. She hated him for pushing. She hated him for seeing it. My ex-boyfriend, she said, the words falling out like stones. He came to my apartment to get his things. We argued. It got out of hand. It's fine. It got out of hand, Gabriel repeated, tasting the words. They tasted like ash. He choked you. He just grabbed me. He choked you, Gabriel stated again, factually brutally. A man grabs a woman's throat for one of 2 reasons, to kill her or to show her he can. Which was it? A tear finally broke free, sliding down Chloe's pale cheek. She scrubbed it away violently with the heel of her hand. Does it matter he's gone? He left. Name. Mr. Rossi, please. Name Chloe. David Miller. Her voice broke on the name. She looked away, her shoulders collapsing inward, the fight draining out of her. Please don't do anything. He's a bartender at the Blue Room downtown. He knows people. Bad people. I just want to leave it alone. Gabriel stood up slowly. The Blue Room, a mid-tier dive bar run by an Irish crew he vaguely tolerated. A nobody. A roach. You're not going back to your apartment, Gabriel said. It wasn't a suggestion. I have to. You're staying in the guest room down the hall. He turned away from her, walking back toward the liquor cabinet, picking up his glass of rye. Lock the door if it makes you feel better. I don't care. But if you try to leave this penthouse before the sun comes up, my men in the lobby will stop you, and you will be very embarrassed. He took a slow sip of the whiskey. It burned, going down a clean, sharp heat that did absolutely nothing to thaw the cold rage expanding in his chest. He looked at her over the rim of the glass. She looked completely shattered, a fragile thing sitting on his expensive furniture, bleeding her messy reality all over his polished floors. Go to sleep, Chloe, he said, his tone dismissing her. He waited until she slowly, shakily pushed herself off the couch. He watched her limp slightly as she walked down the long, shadowed hallway. He listened for the click of the guest room door. He listened for the heavy clunk of the deadbolt sliding into place. She locked it. Good. She had some survival instinct left. Gabriel pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen cast a harsh glare on his tired face. He dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice. "Yeah, boss," a gruff voice answered thick with sleep. "Wake up, Marco." Gabriel set his eyes fixed on the rain sliding down the dark glass of the windows. "I need an address for a David Miller, bartender at the Blue Room, and get the car ready." "Now, boss, it's 2:30 in the morning." Gabriel looked down at his own hands. They had stopped shaking. They were perfectly steady, perfectly still. The chaos in his head had coalesced into a single razor-sharp point of focus. "I know what time it is," Gabriel said softly. "Get the car." The rain hadn't stopped. It was coming down harder now, a relentless drumming assault against the windshield of the black SUV. Gabriel sat in the back seat, staring out at the blurred neon lights of the city. The leather seat was cold. The silence in the car was thick, broken only by the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers and Marco's heavy breathing from the driver's seat. "He lives in a walk-up in the South Loop," Marco said, glancing at the rearview mirror. "Third floor. Building security is a joke. Just a buzzer system that's been broken since 2022. Gabriel didn't reply. He was looking at his hands again. He was acutely aware of his own hypocrisy. He was a man who ordered violence, who committed it himself when necessity demanded. He had broken bones to collect debts, ruined lives to protect his territory. He was not a good man. He had never pretended to be. So why was his blood rushing like a freight train over a bruised girl in a cheap sweater? He analyzed it clinically, trying to detach the emotion from the action. Was it ownership? Chloe was a subordinate. His property in the archaic, unspoken rules of the life he led. You don't touch what belongs to the boss. It was a matter of respect. If a dog bites your sheep, you shoot the dog, not because you love the sheep, but because the dog needs to learn a lesson about boundaries. Liar, a small, cynical voice whispered in his head. It wasn't about respect. It was the memory of her flinch. It was the smell of fear that clung to her. It was the sheer, pathetic vulnerability of a woman who double-checked routing numbers by day and got used as a punching bag by night and still tried to apologize for being in the way. It offended him on a molecular level. It made him feel something dangerously close to pity, and Gabriel despised pity. It was a useless emotion. Rage, however, was highly productive. The SUV pulled into an alleyway behind a dilapidated brick building. The tires crunched over broken glass and wet trash. "Wait here," Gabriel said. "You want me to come up, boss?" Marco asked, shifting into park. "Make it quick." "No." Gabriel popped the door open. The damp, freezing air hit him instantly, carrying the smell of rotting garbage and wet asphalt. "I need to have a conversation." He stepped out into the rain, not bothering to pull his collar up. The cold felt grounding. It sharpened his edges. He walked to the rusted fire escape, testing the bottom rung with a heavy boot, before hauling himself up. He climbed silently, his movements precise and practiced, ignoring the slick metal and the freezing rain soaking through his shirt. Third floor. A single window with a cracked pane, a faint yellow light spilling through the blinds. Gabriel tested the frame. Unlocked. Idiots always thought they were safe in their own filth. He slid the window up with a grating screech that was masked by a sudden crack of thunder. He stepped into the apartment. It smelled like stale beer, old weed, and cheap aerosol deodorant. The living room was a mess of takeaway containers and dirty laundry. A television was left unmuted, playing an infomercial that cast a manic flickering light over the cramped space. Gabriel stood still, letting his eyes adjust, listening. A soft snoring came from the open doorway to the left. He walked into the bedroom. The air here was thicker, warmer. On a mattress on the floor, tangled in gray sheets, lay David Miller. He was asleep on his stomach, one arm dangling off the edge. He was bigger than Gabriel expected, thick shoulders, heavy arms. The kind of guy who threw his weight around when he drank. Gabriel didn't wake him up right away. He stood at the foot of the bed, a dark specter dripping rainwater onto the cheap linoleum floor. He looked at the man's hands, broad, thick-fingered, the hands that had clamped down on Chloe's throat. A sudden, sharp memory flared in Gabriel's mind, the shape of the crescent moon scratch on her collarbone. Without a word, Gabriel stepped forward. He didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. He reached down, grabbed a fistful of David's greasy hair, and yanked him backward violently, tearing him out of sleep. David yelled a wet, confused sound as his head was jerked back. Before he could orient himself, Gabriel's other hand closed around his throat. Gabriel didn't squeeze. Not yet. He just held him there, pinning him against the mattress, leaning his weight into his arm. Who the fuck? David thrashed his hands, coming up to claw at Gabriel's wrist. Shh, Gabriel whispered. He leaned closer until his face was inches from David's. He let the dim light catch his features, watching the confusion in David's eyes curdle into sudden freezing terror as he recognized the man holding him down. Gabriel Rossi wasn't a secret in this city. He was a ghost story told in bars, exactly like the Blue Room. Mr. Rossi! David choked out his voice, a pathetic squeak. I don't owe. No, you don't owe me money, Gabriel said calmly. The contrast between his conversational tone and the violence of his grip was jarring. I'm here about a different kind of debt. Gabriel let his thumb slide slowly over David's windpipe, applying just a fraction of pressure. David gagged his eyes, bugging out. Chloe, Gabriel said. The name felt heavy in his mouth. David froze. The fight completely left his body, replaced by a rigid, terrified stillness. She sent you, Gabriel laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, devoid of any humor. Chloe? Numbers Chloe sat on my couch, terrified, bleeding into a cheap sweater, and begged me not to hurt you. She told me you were connected. She thought she was protecting herself from the fallout. Gabriel leaned more of his weight onto David's throat. The man started to kick his heels, drumming weakly against the mattress. But you see, David? Gabriel murmured, the civilized veneer finally cracking, revealing the absolute predator beneath. I don't care what she wants. I don't care about your connections. I look at you and I see a structural flaw in my organization. You put your hands on my employee. You broke something that belongs in my house. I was drunk. David wheezed, spit flying from his lips. We were arguing. I swear to God, Mr. Rossi, it was an accident. An accident, Gabriel repeated softly. He looked at David's hand, currently clawing uselessly at Gabriel's arm. Which hand, David? Which one was the accident? David didn't answer. He couldn't. He was turning a mottled shade of red. Gabriel loosened his grip just enough to let the man drag in a ragged, sobbing breath. I'm going to explain the new reality to you, David. You are going to pack a bag. You are going to leave Chicago. If you ever breathe the same zip code as Chloe again, if you ever text her, call her, or so much as look at her shadow on a sidewalk. Gabriel leaned in, his voice a silken threat. I won't come to your bedroom to talk. I will have Marco drag you to a warehouse by your ankles, and I will spend 3 days taking you apart with industrial tools. Gabriel released him. He stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers as if he had touched something diseased. David rolled over, violently coughing, clutching his own throat, curling into a pathetic, gasping ball. Gabriel looked down at him, feeling no satisfaction, no righteous triumph. Just a cold, empty disgust. He turned and walked out of the apartment, leaving the window open to the freezing rain. As he climbed back down the fire escape, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. He got back into the SUV. Done, Marco asked, putting the car in drive. Drive, Gabriel said, resting his head against the cold window. He closed his eyes. He had fixed the problem. He had eliminated the threat. That was what he did. He was a manager of crises. But as the car rolled through the wet, slick streets back toward his penthouse, back toward the girl locked in his guest room, he knew he hadn't fixed anything. He had seen her bruises. He had tasted the violence it took to avenge them. And something deep, foundational, and highly dangerous inside the Mafia boss had irrevocably shattered. The real problem wasn't David. The real problem was what Gabriel was going to do when he got back to that apartment and realized he didn't want to let her leave. Dawn in Chicago didn't break. It leaked. A slow gray seepage that washed the color out of the city and left the skyscrapers looking like tombstones. Gabriel stood under the scalding spray of his shower for 20 minutes. He scrubbed at his skin with a stiff bristled brush until his chest and arms were flushed red, trying to get the smell of David Miller's filthy apartment out of his pores. It wasn't the dirt that clung to him. It was the pathetic, groveling terror. It made his stomach turn. He turned the water off the sudden silence ringing in his ears. He grabbed a towel, wrapped it low around his waist, and wiped the steam from the mirror. The face looking back at him was harsh-lined with exhaustion, the dark stubble on his jaw making the shadows under his eyes look like bruises. Bruises. Gabriel threw the towel onto the marble floor and walked into his bedroom to dress. He chose a charcoal sweater and dark slacks, casual but expensive enough to maintain the invisible barrier between him and the rest of the world. He didn't bother with a watch. When he walked into the kitchen, the smell of burnt coffee hit him first. Chloe was standing by the espresso machine, staring at the digital interface as if it were a bomb counting down. She was still in the same faded gray sweater, though she had clearly tried to smooth her messy hair down with water. The harsh LED lighting under the kitchen cabinets was entirely unforgiving. Without the shadows of the living room to hide her, the damage to her face and neck was stark. The bruising had deepened overnight, settling into an angry, swollen violet. Her lower lip was split. She jumped when his bare foot scraped against the tile. She whirled around, knocking a ceramic espresso cup off the counter. It hit the floor and shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. "I'm sorry," she gasped instantly, dropping to her knees. Her hands scrambled over the floor, gathering the sharp shards of ceramic with zero regard for her own skin. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Rossi. I didn't know how to use the machine. I pressed the wrong button, and it just kept grinding." "Stop!" Gabriel's voice cracked like a whip in the pristine kitchen. Chloe froze on her hands and knees, clutching a handful of broken ceramic. Her shoulders were trembling so violently he could see the fabric of her sweater vibrating. Gabriel closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, fighting the surge of absolute rage that spiked in his chest. He wasn't angry at the broken cup. He didn't care about the cup. He was furious at the way she cowered. He wanted to drag David Miller back from whatever hole he was hiding in and break his hands with a hammer just for installing this reflex in her. He walked over to her, his steps slow and deliberate, so he wouldn't startle her again. He crouched down. She kept her chin tucked to her chest, her eyes fixed on the grout between the tiles. "Open your hand," he said quietly. She hesitated, her breathing shallow and ragged. Slowly, her fingers uncurled. 2 of the sharp pieces had dug into her palm. A thin bead of blood was already welling up against her pale skin. Gabriel didn't ask for permission. He reached out and took her wrist. Her skin was freezing. He felt her pulse hammering wildly against his thumb like a trapped bird. He picked the pieces of ceramic out of her hand, dropping them onto the pile on the floor. "It's a cup," he said, keeping his voice carefully leveled, devoid of any inflection. "It's clay and glaze. It means nothing. You don't bleed on my floor over a cup." He let go of her wrist, stood up, and grabbed a dish towel from the oven handle. He tossed it onto the counter. "Press that on your hand. Leave the mess." He watched her scramble up, grabbing the towel and pressing it to her palm. She backed away until her spine hit the stainless steel refrigerator. She looked like she expected him to hit her. The realization tasted like bile in the back of his throat. "I have a meeting at 10, Gabriel said, turning his back to her to deal with the espresso machine himself. He dumped the burnt grounds, his motion sharp and mechanical. "You are not going to the office." "But the quarterly reports are done." Gabriel cut her off. "I'll have Sal pick them up from the table. You're staying here." "Mr. Rossi, I can't stay here." Her voice was trembling, but there was a thread of desperate panic in it. "I have to go home. I have to feed my cat. I have to get clean clothes. Your cat is fine. I sent someone to your apartment an hour ago. The cat is with your neighbor. Your clothes are in a duffel bag currently sitting in the entryway." He pulled a shot of espresso, the machine whirring smoothly under his command. He didn't look at her as he spoke. He couldn't. "You are not going back to that apartment. Ever. You sent someone to my apartment." She repeated the words hollow. "You went through my things." "I didn't. Marco did. That's illegal. You can't just—" Gabriel turned around, leaning his hips against the counter, holding the tiny steaming cup of black coffee. He leveled a stare at her that killed the rest of her sentence in her throat. "I don't operate within the confines of what is legal, Chloe. You audit my front companies. You are not stupid. You know exactly what I am." He took a sip of the espresso. It was bitter, scorching his tongue. "You are not safe in that apartment. He has a key. He knows your schedule. So you will stay here until I find you a new place in a secure building with a doorman who actually does his job." "David won't come back," she whispered, her eyes dropping to the floor. "He was just drunk. He got scared when I threatened to call the police." Gabriel set the cup down. The ceramic clinked sharply against the granite. David Miller caught a Greyhound to St. Louis at 4 o'clock this morning. He emptied his bank account and left everything else behind. He is not coming back to Chicago. Chloe's head snapped up. Her hazel eyes were wide, horrified. The math clicked together in her head. "What did you do?" She breathed the towel slipping from her bleeding hand. Gabriel looked at her perfectly pale, bruised face. He didn't soften his expression. He didn't offer comfort. He gave her the brutal, unvarnished truth. "I had a conversation with him," Gabriel said, his voice flat. "He agreed that the climate in Illinois was no longer suited for his health." Chloe pressed her hand over her mouth, a small choked sound escaping her. It wasn't relief. It was sheer terror. She was looking at him not as her boss, but as the monster he actually was. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, backing further away until there was nowhere left to go. "You had no right." "I have every right." Gabriel snapped the control, slipping for just a second. He touched what is mine to manage. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mine. It wasn't the corporate ownership of an employee. It was something older, something predatory. Gabriel saw the exact moment she realized it. She swallowed hard, her throat shifting beneath the ugly yellowing bruises. "Sit at the table," Gabriel commanded quietly, breaking the silence. "I'll get the first aid kit." She didn't argue. She just moved a ghost, haunting his kitchen, trapped in a cage made of bulletproof glass and Italian marble. By the fourth day, the penthouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a pressurized submarine. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was thick, practically humming with unsaid things. Chloe hadn't tried to leave. Gabriel knew she had checked the front door once he had heard the heavy deadbolt click while he was in his study, but she hadn't opened it. She was smart enough to know that the two men in dark suits standing by the elevator banks wouldn't let her pass. Instead, she shrank. She tried to take up as little space as humanly possible. She kept to the guest room, only emerging to sit at the far end of his massive dining table with her laptop, drowning herself in spreadsheets. She wore her own clothes, now baggy jeans, oversized sweatshirts that swallowed her frame. Gabriel's routine had fractured. He was a man who thrived on control, on being out in the city and forcing his will. Now he found himself delegating tasks to his lieutenants over encrypted phone lines, pacing his study. His ear constantly tuned to the faint sounds of her typing, her breathing, the soft scrape of her chair. It was pathetic. It was a weakness. He knew it, and he couldn't stop it. It was Thursday evening. Outside, the city was smothered under a thick blanket of fog. The ambient light in the penthouse was a soft, dim gold. Gabriel sat on the leather sofa, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand, a stack of heavily redacted shipping manifests on the coffee table. He wasn't reading them. He was watching her. She was at the dining table, chewing nervously on the end of a pen. The swelling on her face had gone down, but the bruising had bloomed into a spectacular display of sickly greens and deep purples. The handprint on her throat was painfully distinct, fading to a mustard yellow at the edges. She reached up, wincing slightly, and rubbed the back of her neck. "There's ibuprofen in the top drawer of the master bath," Gabriel said. Chloe flinched. She hadn't realized he was watching her. She dropped her hand quickly to her lap. "I'm fine, thank you." "Your shoulders are rigid. You've been wincing every time you look at the screen for the last hour. You have a tension headache." Gabriel set his glass down. "Stop suffering quietly. It's irritating." She looked at him, a flicker of genuine defiance finally piercing through the exhaustion in her eyes. "If my presence is irritating Mr. Rossi, you can always unlock the door." Gabriel didn't rise to the bait. He stood up, walked into the kitchen, and pulled a gel ice pack from the freezer. He wrapped it in a clean dish towel. He walked over to the dining table and stopped right behind her chair. Chloe went completely still. The rhythmic tapping of her keyboard ceased. He could smell that artificial vanilla scent again, mixed with the faint metallic smell of healing bruises. He didn't ask. He reached down and pressed the ice pack against the base of her neck. She let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, her shoulders jumping toward her ears. But she didn't pull away. The cold must have felt good against the inflammation. Gabriel stood there, his hand holding the ice pack against her skin. He was close enough to see the fine hairs on the back of her neck, close enough to see the delicate, fragile line of her collarbone beneath the oversized sweater. The proximity was intoxicating. It made his chest ache in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with a gunshot wound or a broken rib. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. She didn't turn around. If she moved, she would brush against him. "Doing what?" Gabriel asked softly. "Keeping me here." She swallowed. "You took care of David. The threat is gone. So why am I still a prisoner?" Gabriel looked down at the crown of her head. He could lie. He could tell her it was protocol that he was waiting for the paperwork on her new apartment to clear that he was protecting his corporate assets. But the quiet intimacy of the room, the fog pressing against the windows, stripped the lies away. "Because I am not done," he said slowly, the words heavy and dangerous. "Done with what?" "Looking at you." Chloe's breath hitched. "Every time I look at your throat, I see another man's hands on you," Gabriel murmured, leaning down just slightly, his voice dropping into a register that was meant only for her. "I see a lack of respect. I see a mess that hasn't been cleaned up yet. And until those marks fade, until the visual evidence that someone else touched you is gone from my sight, you are staying right here." It was the most honest, toxic thing he had ever said to a woman. It wasn't about her safety. It was about his ego, his possessiveness, a primal sickness in his gut that demanded a clean slate. Chloe slowly reached up, her trembling fingers wrapping around his wrist. Her hands were small, her skin soft, despite the calluses from typing. She didn't push his hand away. She just held his wrist. "You're suffocating me," she whispered, a tear slipping free and splashing onto the keyboard of her laptop. Gabriel felt the wet drop hit the plastic. He looked at her hand on his wrist. He was a man who crushed windpipes, who broke kneecaps, who orchestrated the demise of rival families with a casual flick of a pen. And yet the slight pressure of her fingers felt like a steel trap snapping shut on his arm. "I know," Gabriel said softly. He didn't move his hand. Neither did she. They stayed locked in that terrible silent standoff, the ice pack numbing her pain, while his presence completely consumed the air in the room. The illusion of the penthouse as a safe, isolated bubble shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. It started with a phone call Gabriel couldn't ignore. A shipment of untraceable firearms routed through the port of Gary, Indiana, had been intercepted by a crew loyal to the Moretti family. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a blatant provocation. Gabriel had spent 3 hours locked in his study shouting in Italian, his voice a guttural roar that bled through the heavy oak door. Chloe had retreated to the guest room, burying her head under a pillow, terrified of the violence leaking into the air-conditioning vents. At 4 p.m., Gabriel unlocked his study door. He looked manic. His tie was discarded, the sleeves of his expensive shirt rolled up to his elbows, revealing the faded ink of a syndicate tattoo on his left forearm. "Stay in the guest room," he told Chloe as she tentatively peeked out. His voice was a harsh bark. "Do not come out. If you hear voices, ignore them. If you hear loud noises, get in the closet." Before she could ask what a loud noise meant, the private elevator chimed. Gabriel turned his hand, instinctively dropping to the small of his back, where his holster rested against his spine. The doors slid open. 4 men stepped out. They were broad-shouldered, their suits poorly tailored, smelling of stale cigarette smoke, wet asphalt, and the sharp coppery tang of fresh blood. One of them was Sal. He was holding a man by the back of the neck. The man's face was a ruin of split skin and swelling tissue. He was sobbing, dragging his left leg behind him at an unnatural angle. Chloe clamped a hand over her mouth, stumbling backward into the guest room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. She backed away until she hit the edge of the bed, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She knew who Gabriel Rossi was. Everyone in the corporate office knew the rumors. But knowing it in the abstract, seeing numbers on a spreadsheet, was completely different from smelling the blood in the hallway. Through the thick wood of the door, the sounds were muffled, but unmistakable. The heavy thud of a body hitting the hardwood floor. A wet, pathetic whimpering, and then Gabriel's voice. It wasn't the quiet, dangerous tone he used with her. It was a cold, mechanical cadence, the voice of a butcher assessing meat. "Hold him up," she heard Gabriel say. More whimpering. A sharp crack like a baseball bat hitting a melon. A muffled, agonizing scream that was abruptly cut short by a gurgling gasp. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, clapping her hands over her ears. Tears streaming hot and fast down her cheeks. "He's a monster. He's a monster. He's a monster." She sat on the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, rocking slightly, waiting for the violence to end. It felt like hours, though the digital clock on the nightstand told her it was only 20 minutes. Eventually, the penthouse fell silent. She heard the elevator chime. The doors slide open and slide shut. Silence. Chloe didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs were numb. The image of the man's ruined face was burned into her retinas, overlaying the memory of Gabriel gently holding an ice pack to her neck. The cognitive dissonance was tearing her mind apart. A soft knock on the door made her jump, a strangled cry escaping her lips. "Chloe." It was Gabriel. His voice was exhausted quiet. "They're gone." She didn't answer. "Open the door." It wasn't a request. Shaking uncontrollably, she forced herself up, stumbling to the door. She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled it open a fraction of an inch. Gabriel stood in the hallway. He had washed his hands. She noticed that immediately. The cuffs of his shirt were slightly damp. He had put his jacket back on, hiding the holster, hiding the tattoos. He was trying to look like the CEO again, but his eyes were entirely dead. He looked at her, taking in her tear-stained face, her trembling posture, the absolute abject terror radiating from her pores. He didn't step forward. For the first time since she had arrived, he kept his distance. "The mess is cleaned up," he said, his voice flat. "I ordered food. It will be here in 20 minutes. I heard it," she whispered. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Gabriel's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. "I told you to ignore it." He was screaming. "He stole from me." "So you tortured him in your living room." She choked out a sudden hysterical anger piercing through her fear. "You beat him until he couldn't stand up." Gabriel's eyes darkened, the deadness vanishing, replaced by a flash of predatory heat. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, pushing the door open wider. Chloe stumbled back, hitting the wall. I broke his kneecap to get a name, Gabriel corrected her, his voice dropping into that terrifying silky register. And then I put a bullet in his lung because he lied to me. I don't torture people for fun, Chloe. I do it because it is the only currency the men in my world understand. Chloe stared at him, her chest heaving. The smell of bleach was strong again. He had cleaned the floor. You're terrified of me, Gabriel stated. It wasn't a question. Yes. She didn't lie. She couldn't. Gabriel looked at her face. The yellowing bruises on her throat, the split lip that was finally healing. He looked at his own hands, the knuckles bruised and raw from breaking a man's jaw 10 minutes ago. He reached out. Chloe flinched, slamming her eyes shut, turning her face away, bracing for the strike. The strike never came. Instead, rough calloused fingers that had just extinguished a human life, gently brushed a stray tear from her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, meticulously avoiding the bruised skin. His touch was so careful, it felt like a surgical procedure. I am a terrible man, Chloe, Gabriel whispered, standing so close she could feel the heat radiating off his chest, could smell the cordite and soap on his skin. I do horrible things to people who cross me, but I am not him. Chloe opened her eyes. He was staring at her, his dark eyes intense, obsessive, completely unhinged. You're worse. She breathed the truth, slipping out like a blade. Gabriel didn't pull away. He didn't look angry. If anything, a dark, terrible satisfaction flickered in his eyes. I know, he murmured, his thumb resting against the pulse point on her neck. And yet you're the safest thing in this city right now, because nothing that breathes will ever touch you again without my permission. Do you understand? Chloe stared up at him, trapped between the monster who had hurt her and the devil who was currently holding her together. She swallowed hard, feeling his thumb press slightly against her rapid pulse. Yes, she whispered. Gabriel nodded once. He let his hand drop. Good. Come eat your dinner. He turned and walked down the hallway, leaving her leaning against the wall, shivering completely and utterly trapped. 3 weeks. That was exactly how long it took for the human body to digest and erase the violent evidence of a handprint. In those 21 days, the atmosphere inside the penthouse shifted. The blinding, suffocating terror Chloe felt during that first week didn't vanish, but it mutated. It calcified into a bizarre, unspoken domesticity. They moved around each other like two apex predators confined to the same enclosure, acutely aware of every breath, every scrape of a chair, every drop of water hitting the stainless steel sink. Gabriel had stopped telling her to stay in the guest room. She had stopped trying to hide there. She began taking her coffee on the leather sofa, her legs tucked under her, watching him stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows while he took his morning calls. He spoke in rapid, clipped Italian, or a low, threatening English that would have sent her spiraling a month ago. Now she just listened to the cadence. She learned the subtle tightening of his jaw when a shipment was delayed. She learned that he rubbed the knuckles of his left hand when he was contemplating a violent retaliation. She was adjusting to the monster. That realization terrified her more than the gun strapped to his lower back. The cheap, oversized sweaters were gone. Gabriel had quietly ordered an entire wardrobe to be delivered. Cashmere, silk, tailored trousers. He never mentioned them, just left the garment bags hanging on her door. The first time she walked into the kitchen, wearing a dark green silk blouse, the fabric whispering against her skin. Gabriel had stopped mid-sentence on the phone. He stared at her for 5 agonizing seconds, his dark eyes tracking the way the silk draped over her collarbone, before he turned his back and hung up. He was watching the timeline on her skin. Chloe knew it. Every evening, when the ambient light in the living room softened to a bruised purple, she felt his gaze settle heavily on her throat. The deep violet had faded into a sickly green, which slowly bled out into a faint, jaundiced yellow. They never talked about David. They never talked about the man screaming on the hardwood floor. They talked about shipping logistics profit margins for the front companies, the humidity in the city. Safe, sterile things that formed a thin sheet of ice over a boiling ocean. "You're using the wrong cipher for the offshore routing," Gabriel said one night standing behind her chair at the dining table. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating through his suit jacket. He smelled like expensive gin and the crisp, clean scent of dry-cleaned cotton. Chloe didn't flinch. She just kept typing, her eyes fixed on the screen. "I'm using the cipher Sal gave me." "Wah! Sal is an idiot!" Gabriel murmured, his voice a low vibration that traveled straight down her spine. He reached over her shoulder, his arm brushing against hers. He tapped the backspace key heavily with his index finger. "Use the secondary algorithmic sequence. The feds flagged the Moretti accounts yesterday. We aren't making the same mistake." Chloe watched his hand. The knuckles were still slightly bruised, a permanent testament to his daily life. "You're trusting me with the secondary sequence?" she asked quietly. "That's the core ledger. The real one." Gabriel paused. His hand hovered over the keyboard. He looked down at the side of her face, his gaze tracing the line of her jaw, sliding down to the hollow of her throat. The yellow tinge was almost entirely gone. Just a faint shadow remained, and even that was disappearing under the dim lighting. "I trust you to know the consequences of making a mistake," Gabriel said. It was meant to sound like a threat, but the slight huskiness in his voice betrayed him. It sounded like an admission of absolute defeat. He pulled his hand back quickly, taking a step away, putting the cold, necessary distance between them. "Fix the ledger. I'm going out." Chloe listened to the heavy door click shut. The penthouse felt immediately vast, empty, and cold. She reached up, touching her own throat, her fingers pressing into the skin where the handprint used to be. It didn't hurt anymore. The physical damage was gone, and a heavy sinking dread settled in her stomach. It happened on a Tuesday morning. The sun was blindingly bright, pouring through the glass and bouncing off the marble floors in harsh, unforgiving angles. Chloe was standing at the kitchen island drinking a glass of water. Her hair was pulled back into a messy clip, exposing her neck completely. Gabriel walked out of his bedroom, adjusting his cuffs, his face set in the rigid, unreadable mask he wore when he was preparing for a sit-down with his captains. He stopped in the center of the living room. His eyes locked onto her throat. The morning light stripped away all shadows. The skin was pale, pristine, and perfectly flawless. The bruising was completely, definitively gone. Gabriel stood there for a long time. The silence stretched until it felt fragile, ready to snap and take off someone's hand. He didn't say a word. He walked to the entryway console table, picked up a small, heavy black envelope, and walked into the kitchen. He tossed the envelope onto the granite island. It landed with a soft, final thud right next to her water glass. "Streeterville," Gabriel said. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion. 24th floor. The building has armed security biometric scanners in the elevators and an underground garage. It's registered under a shell corporation. The lease is paid for the next 5 years. Sal is downstairs with the car to take your things." Chloe stared at the black envelope. The words didn't compute immediately. She looked up at his face. His jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle twitched near his ear. He wasn't looking at her eyes. He was staring fixedly at the wall just behind her head. "The bruising is gone," Gabriel stated, pointing a single rigid finger toward her neck. "The visual evidence has been removed. You are no longer required to stay." A cold shock hit Chloe's system, quickly followed by a hot, entirely unexpected surge of furious betrayal. "You're kicking me out," she whispered, her hands gripping the edge of the granite counter so hard her knuckles turned white. "I am relocating you." Gabriel corrected his tone. "Sterile corporate. You were a security risk. The risk has been neutralized. The situation has been resolved." "Resolved." She repeated the word, tasting like ash. She looked at him. Really looked at him. Beneath the tailored suit and the cold, dead eyes, he was terrified. Gabriel Rossi, the man who broke bones with his bare hands and orchestrated murders over morning coffee, was panicking. He was pushing her out because the excuse to keep her was gone, and the reality of what would happen if she stayed with no conditions attached was tearing him apart. If she stayed now, it wasn't because she was broken. It was because she chose the dark. And he knew his world destroyed everything it touched. "Take the envelope, Chloe," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. "Pack your bags. Go back to your life." "I don't have a life." Chloe shot back, her voice suddenly loud, vibrating with an anger she didn't know she possessed. She stepped away from the counter, walking around the island until she was standing 3 feet in front of him. "You took it. You hunted down my ex. You moved my things. You showed me the man bleeding on your floor. You pulled me so deep into your orbit that normal people look like aliens to me now." Gabriel's eyes finally snapped down to meet hers. A dark, violent storm was brewing behind his irises. "I showed you exactly what I am so you would have the good sense to run when I opened the door." "Then why didn't you open the door 3 weeks ago?" she demanded, stepping closer. She could smell the mint of his toothpaste, the dark, heavy scent of his cologne. "Why wait until I stopped shaking when you walked into the room? Why wait until I learned how to fix your ledgers?" "Because you were broken." He snarled, a visceral, primal sound tearing out of his throat. He reached out, his large hands hovering just inches from her arms, clearly fighting the urge to grab her, to shake her, to pull her against his chest. "Someone broke you, and I couldn't stomach looking at it. Now you're fixed. Now you leave." Chloe let out a breathless, cynical laugh. The sound shocked them both. "You think I'm fixed because the skin turned white?" she asked softly. She reached out, pressing her index finger dead center against Gabriel's chest, right over his tie. The fabric was stiff over the hard muscle underneath. "You didn't fix me, Gabriel. You just infected me with something else." Gabriel went completely rigid at the use of his first name. He stared down at her, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. The mask was slipping entirely. The pristine, controlled boss of the Chicago syndicate was crumbling into the man underneath a man starving, obsessed, and fully aware he was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Take the card." He ordered one last time, the command sounding more like a plea. "Walk out of that door, Chloe, because if you don't walk out right now, I am never ever going to let you leave." The penthouse held its breath. The traffic on the streets below was a muted, distant hum through the thick glass. The sunlight felt heavy, pinning them both to the floorboards. Chloe looked at the black envelope on the counter. Inside was safety. Inside was a sterile, beautiful apartment with a doorman who would smile at her where she could order takeout and watch television and pretend the last month never happened. Inside was a quiet, desperately lonely life where she would spend every night jumping at shadows, remembering the way David's hands felt on her throat, and wishing for the terrifying, suffocating presence of Gabriel Rossi to block the door. She wasn't a good person either. Not anymore. She realized that now. She didn't want the light. She wanted the monster who guarded her in the dark. Chloe turned her back on the envelope. She took the final step forward, closing the agonizing gap between them. She didn't hesitate. She reached up, wrapping her hands in the lapels of his expensive suit jacket, and pulled him down to her level. Gabriel let out a ragged, shattering sound. It was the sound of a dam breaking. His hands, the hands that dealt in violence and ruin, came up and completely enveloped her face. His palms were rough, calloused, and unutterably warm. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. He just held her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones, his forehead dropping down to rest heavily against hers. He was shaking. The Mafia boss, the ghost story of the South Loop, was trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. "You don't know what you're doing," Gabriel whispered against her lips, his breath hot and frantic. "I ruin everything. My world is a meat grinder. You'll drown." "I know how to hold my breath," Chloe whispered back, her fingers tightening their death grip on his lapels. "I'm possessive. I'm paranoid. I will suffocatingly control every square inch of your existence." He was listing his sins, begging her to see the chains he was offering. "I know. You're a civilian. You don't belong here." "Then corrupt me," she said, her voice dropping into a cynical, breathless demand. "Ruin me, because I am not taking the envelope." Gabriel groaned, a sound torn straight from the darkest part of his soul, and finally crashed his mouth down on hers. There was nothing gentle about it. It wasn't a romance novel kiss. It was a collision. It tasted like coffee whiskey and desperate, violent possession. He kissed her like a man claiming territory, his hands sliding from her face to grip her waist, lifting her entirely off the ground. Chloe gasped into his mouth, her arms wrapping tight around his neck, anchoring herself to the storm. He backed her up, moving blindly, until her spine hit the edge of the kitchen island. The black envelope was knocked off the counter, fluttering harmlessly to the marble floor, forgotten. Gabriel pulled away just enough to look at her. His eyes were entirely black, dilated with adrenaline and a terrible, consuming hunger. He brushed his thumb roughly over her jaw, exactly over the spot where the yellow bruise used to be. The ghost of the handprint was erased, replaced by the heavy, burning brand of his touch. "You're mine," Gabriel stated. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a corporate mandate. It was a biological fact. Chloe looked up at the devil in the bespoke suit. She felt the heavy weight of his gun pressing against her hip, felt the dangerous electric current of his life completely engulfing hers. She had traded a petty, abusive coward for an apex predator. She had traded the illusion of a normal life for a velvet cage, and she had absolutely no regrets. "Yes!" She breathed, her hands sliding into his dark hair, pulling him back down. "I am." Outside, the Chicago sirens wailed a chaotic symphony of the violent, messy world Gabriel ruled. Inside, the heavy oak door remained dead-bolted shut. Chloe didn't need the key card to survive anymore. She had cracked the code to the monster, and she was never going back to the light. If you felt the dark, twisted tension of Gabriel and Chloe's story, hit that like button right now. We dive deep into the messy, flawed, and raw sides of romance that most stories are too afraid to touch. Did Chloe make the right choice, staying with a monster who keeps her safe? Or did she just trade one cage for another? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We really want to read your theories. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow dark romance readers and subscribe to the channel for more gripping, heavy-hitting storytelling every single week.